Last month, the metals company, formerly known as DeepGreen, went public in a $300 million financing. Is this enough gas in the tank to make deep sea mining a reality? I'm with CEO Gerard Barron. Gerard, welcome to Kitco.
Michael, great to be with you today.
Let's start with the company. What is a metals company and how did it come together?
So the metals company, as you said, formerly known as DeepGreen, we've been around over a decade now, and we're focused on one thing, and that's collecting polymetallic nodules from our license areas in the Clarion-Clipperton Zone in the Pacific Ocean. And the premise is that we're going to need a whole heap more metals as we start moving through this green transition, and we can produce them at a fraction of the environmental and societal impacts by collecting these nodules and turning them into metals compared to the land-based alternative.
A lot of questions, but you have it with you. What's special about nodules? I mean, the sea is a big place. Why are you specifically focused on these formations?
Yeah, it's a good question, and it's a really special resource, and they form in a different way because they literally precipitate the metals that are in solution in the ocean water or in the sediment upon which they sit. And so this one in my hand would be 3 to 4 million years old, and it's a nickel is the main revenue driver. There's about 1.4% nickel in this nodule, and 1.1% copper, and about 0.2% cobalt, and about 30% manganese. And so it's very aligned to what base metals we need as we move through this transition away from fossil fuels into electrification. And it has other unique characteristics as well. For example, when we bring them to shore and we turn them into metals, we generate zero tailings and zero waste. And just on that topic alone, last year the mining industry was the largest generator of waste. In fact, there was around 190 billion tons of waste generated. And to put that into context, municipal waste was around 2 billion tons. So we can collect these nodules and process them and generate no waste and no tailings. So it's a pretty special resource.
I know that you've had some studies on this, but could you just talk about what the potential resources, where these nodules are, and what they would be like for processing?
Well, let's think about where they are. They were discovered way back in the 1870s, and British explorers wanted to know what lay on the bottom of the ocean. So they sailed HMS Challenger around the seas for 4 years. And they discovered them in a number of locations, but there's one area of particular interest, and it's this area known as the CCZ. And the reason why it's of interest is because a little bit to the right are the Rockies and the Andes that, of course, were covered in nickel and copper, and through volcanogenic explosion, it means that all these metals ended up in the Pacific Ocean. And so as these nodules grew, they precipitated those metals and form these very valuable, time-appropriate resources. Now, we're a Canadian company, and we have resource statements on 2 of our license areas. And so we know that we have around 1.6 billion tons of these on those 2 blocks. And it's a fun resource because you get to see it. It's 2-dimensional. You don't have to imagine what's under the ocean floor. Instead, we take pictures of it, whereas on land we'd be drilling thousands of holes to try and put together the shape of this ore body. We literally get to see it running for thousands of kilometers across the ocean floor.
What's the metallurgy like? What is it like extracting nickel from these nodules?
Yeah, so there are basically 2 approaches, and back in the 1970s, when they were collecting these nodules under trials, and in fact, Kennecott built a onshore processing plant. Kennecott, now part of Rio Tinto, they used a process, the Cuprian, which was mainly focused around the nickel and the copper. But we've actually, for the last decade, been running 2 onshore processing methodologies, and the first was a pure hydromet, where we would basically dissolve them in an acid solution. But we decided to park that idea. We've gone with a more conventional pyro and hydromet combination. And so basically we melt them, and that first pyro step sees us with a manganese silicate material and an alloy or a mat containing all of the nickel, copper, and cobalt. And we then put that through a pretty standard hydromet flow sheet to either produce nickel powders or sulfates. We'll be completed our onshore pilot work for the pyrometallurgy work in the next 3-4 weeks. So we've made good progress there.
I think you've touched on it, but I wanted to step back and then just mention about funding, because that was a really headline number that came out in March. That was a big announcement regarding the special purpose acquisition. I want you to talk about the funding, but I think you've mentioned it also just about the metals. There's another headline around this is that deep sea mining, what you're targeting, it's really kind of targeted around the electric vehicle material space.
Well, it's certainly very aligned with what the electric vehicle industry is going to need a lot of. And Michael, it's interesting that in this nodule, there are 8 parts nickel to 1 part cobalt. So, as the auto industry, for the time being at least, has pretty well settled on a NMC 811 chemistry, then this resource is just perfectly suited to that. And so almost half of the revenues will come from the nickel, and followed by the manganese, copper, and cobalt. So you couldn't ask for a much better mixture of base metals given the environment that we're moving into. But you're right, it was an exciting moment for us to announce that transaction. In total, we'll see around $570 million from the SPAC plus the PIPE. We were originally planning to raise a $200 million PIPE, but we were heavily oversubscribed, and so we took a little bit more. And the good news about that is it provides us the funding to get to first production. And we're anticipating first production in 2024, which is, not far away in certainly resource development timeframes. And the good news is this transaction sees us funded to the other side of that.
Now, there is ocean diamond mining. Are the processes that you're looking at similar, or how are they different?
Well, diamonds, firstly, are located in much shallower water. And so, but you're right, there's a lot of diamonds that have been extracted from our oceans, from those shallow waters today. And but the methodologies, you should think of diamond mining more as a dredging operation. And one of the challenges of diamond mining offshore is the waste, because essentially you are literally hoovering up large areas of ocean floor, these alluvial areas, and about 2% of them might be diamonds. So the other 98% of the material you have to return somewhere. And so sometimes you'll see these operations where there'll be, quite murky waters, plumes surrounding. Whereas if I draw a comparison to what we're focused on, and keep in mind we're only focused on polymetallic nodules, when we have no interest in sulfides or seafloor crusts, because they really do require mining. Whereas these nodules just lay on the ocean floor. And so our collectors will, using a jet propulsion system, collect the nodules, separate out the sediment, and then put the nodules into an air riser to be delivered to our production vessel 4,000 meters above. And then, of course, we offload them to a transporter and move them to shore for further for processing. So from a waste perspective, at 4,000 meters, we can be very efficient. And the good news around the dust or the plume at 4,000 meters and below is that what we're finding is the particles tend to flocculate together, which means they bind together, they become heavier, and they settle quite quickly. And so, you know, we're confident we'll have some, very good news confirming not only our studies around that, but studies from other contractors and institutions who've been focused on this very topic.
Now, we are going to get there's some marketing, there's some ESG issues that have come up in the headlines, but I just want to
Mm.
keep it on. You're talking about production. What's the number one technical challenge right now you would really see to kind of making this deep sea mining viable?
Well, if we cast our mind back 50 years, then there were many great industrial names, Lockheed Martin, Mitsubishi, Sumitomo, BP, and Shell, were starting to collect nodules. This industry was coming alive. Now, of course, what stopped it was that the world had not agreed who owned the oceans. But the good news is a lot of the technical challenges were sorted out 50 years ago. Now, what's happened since then, of course, the offshore oil and gas industry, cable laying, pipeline has blossomed. And so the technological development in that 50 years has been enormous. In fact, today there was a news release by a Belgian company, Demi, who've been trialing their seafloor harvester in the CCZ area, and they today announced very successful trials. So I think the technical challenge is really about scale, because engineers love solving problems. And if I talk to the offshore engineers, they say, look, of course it's difficult, but we've been solving much more complex challenges than this, so we've got this. And when I speak to the onshore engineers, it's pretty well the same. They see a pathway. All of our small scale pilot work has been very encouraging. Our onshore pilot work that we're coming to a completion now with has been equally encouraging. So I think it's really going to be just more around successful implementation, and then obviously reliability. And that's one thing that has improved enormously in 50 years. We need lots of uptime, and so we're hoping that that's something that will just continue to improve. And there'll be hurdles, of course there will be, and but we're feeling confident that many of the technical challenges are well in hand now.
People in the mining space are, of course, familiar with the deep sea miner Nautilus mineral, which had a lot of challenges. And that, of course, was
Mm.
in the last decade. It eventually did go bankrupt in 2019. What's different this time that you think deep sea mining can succeed?
Sure. Well, I always say Nautilus were like the pioneers who ended up with the arrows in the back. They went out there, blazed a trail, but totally different to our efforts. For example, they were focused on seafloor massive sulfides. And that represents an entirely different challenge, because you really do have to go mining those. You've got to build big machines to turn big rocks into little rocks and then pump them to the surface. So firstly, and also the seafloor massive sulfides are located in shallower water, and those areas tend to be more productive. So there's a lot more biomass, more biodiversity in those areas as well. The other thing is that while Nautilus found some of these systems, they didn't find a lot. So the size of what they were able to identify was a fraction. I think they ended up with around 6 million tons of these seafloor massive sulfides. Now, I've already got 1.6 billion tons identified under our 43101. And of course, they operated in Papua New Guinea, and we all know that some of these developing jurisdictions can be challenging. Governments change, the rules can sometimes be a little bit flexible. And in the end, I think Nautilus, just had a series of events and setbacks. And of course, they were operating during the GFC, which meant that financing was challenging. But probably one of the most important factors was that this new demand for the transition away from fossil fuels was only just beginning to take hold. Whereas now there is an enormous amount of focus on the need to make this transition happen and what the true environmental cost might be of increased metal production. And so, you need a lot of things going your way to get a new industry started. And I get the feeling that, we've got a lot of those things, including the capital markets being open to allow us to do this transaction, of course. And so, hopefully our timing is right here, Michael.
Remarking on the scramble for EV materials, Cleantech CEO Sam Riggel said OEM investment in nickel miners is inevitable due to the scramble for metals. Japan said it wants to be self-sufficient in battery materials, possibly looking at ocean floor mining. You've mentioned it with the opening of the financial markets. It just seems like there's a lot of partnerships that are available to you in the EV space.
No, I think you're right. And, we've had the benefit of speaking to those EV companies for the last 2.5, 3 years. And so they're challenged by the availability of raw materials to build their batteries. They're challenged by the price, and they're challenged by sustainability. Now, this is a new set of problems for the auto industry because they always had a very commanding position in the supply chain. And we've seen in recent months car companies have to close their manufacturing facilities because they can't get hold of a simple semiconductor chip. Now, battery metals will be, even more impactful, I think. And so there is no doubt that if you're a major automaker, then you'll have to vertically integrate because you can't just push this supply problem onto the supply chain, because you might find your place in the queue is, not ideal. So, we've seen obviously Tesla lead the way with, building their own battery cells. We've now seen some other automakers make some announcements that they plan to lay some bets in a variety of areas. So, and that's exciting news for a company like us that's trying to develop or planning to develop the world's largest battery materials asset. I mean, the opportunity to partner with some of those automakers who need to vertically integrate opens up an enormous amount of flexibility for us.
The other players I see in your space are GSR and Lockheed Martin's UK Seabed Resources. Do you cooperate?
We encourage. We cooperate around issues to do with the regulator, meaning that we support positions that are reasonable, whether it's under standards and guidelines, but generally, it's we've all got our own strategy, and we've got a very clearly defined one at the metals company, and so I'd call us in a pre-competitive stage, but we're encouraging one another. I probably wouldn't go as far as cooperating.
Now, Gerard, the other headline was the signups that were done with the World Wildlife Fund, and then that was Google, BMW, and a handful of other companies stating that they were asking for more study of deep sea mining. You pushed back strongly, comparing the impact of mining on land versus deep sea mining. We understand the stories, but kind of on a PR basis, what's a strategy to gain wider acceptance of deep sea mining? How do you get ahead of this story?
Well, by awareness, we think that we came out pretty strong against that position because we thought we had to. If the names of companies that we were in dialogue with had been on that list, that would have been a heart-sinking moment. but they weren't. They were companies that we'd never ever spoken to. And so, to take a public stance like that, I thought it was important that we come back and say, hang on, there are some other issues that we all need to be thinking about here, and this is what we're doing about those issues. And so, I think that's the challenge at a wider level as well, because, if I was to like protect the oceans is a very easy idea to get behind. I want to protect the oceans. I consider myself an environmentalist. And if you looked at the terrestrial mining industry and said, now we're going to do that in the oceans, you'd go, that doesn't sound a very good idea at all. But of course, they're nothing alike. We're talking about collecting these nodules off the ocean floor. We're talking about, one of the least densely populated, lowest biomass areas on the planet. Like, there is 1,500 times less biomass where we pick these up from than where we're collecting nickel from in Indonesia. And when you start to understand how that impacts climate, because of course those rainforests are our carbon sinks as well. So it's an education task, and I think we're in it for the long game. We invest a lot of money in the environmental science part of it. Our boat has been on the water for the last 6 weeks. This will be our first campaign of 2021, but there are 3 more. It arrives back to San Diego. It heads straight out again 2 weeks later. I mean, we're investing, we'll invest $75 million on our environmental impact study. And so I think it's just about being transparent. It's about being open, letting people see the results. I mean, we engage scientists from universities and organizations all around the world. Part of the deal is they're free to publish, their findings. And so, yeah, I think it's a long game, but I think when people start to understand the tangible differences between this resource and the alternative, they're going to get behind us, because we're a hands down winner.
What's the milestones for the metals company over the next 12 months?
So by the end of this year, we'll have our harvester in the water, and by middle of next year, we aim to have our end-to-end production system being piloted on our license area. So that's a really exciting moment for us. We also have a lot of commercial conversations underway. We're taking some of these customers with us along the journey of understanding the environmental challenges that we're addressing. And so obviously the onshore pilot processing work is coming to an end for the pyrometallurgical. We'll shortly go out to tender for some of the pilot processing hydro network. We hope to have an area identified for our first onshore processing plant, where we can ship our nodules to in 2024 to turn them into battery metals. Obviously the geopolitics that are very active in the world today are quite helpful for us, because the world has finally woken up to the fact that China has invested well ahead of the curve and dominates the material supply of battery metals. So that means governments are saying, well, how can we encourage you to locate in our jurisdiction as opposed to someone else's? So yeah, there's a lot of exciting action happening at the metals company over the next year, and of course, now that we're moving to a public stage, we have a voice that can be heard, and so that's one of the main reasons why we went down this path. One was to get access to capital so we could accelerate, the project, and the other was to get a louder voice so we can share this very, very important story.
Gerard, thank you for speaking with Kitco.
Hey, Michael, my pleasure.
I've been speaking with CEO Gerard Barron. He is with the Metals Company. My name is Michael McRae. You are watching Kitco Mining.